Okay, things are really escalating here now. We're just getting the news in right now. Attention, everyone. President Donald Trump is considering a major lawsuit against Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell because he claims Powell has done a terrible and grossly incompetent job. On top of that, they're now planning to massively push interest rates down. All of this is playing right into Bitcoin's hands. Jerome Powell really has a problem now and is backed into a corner because new inflation data just came in this morning, and this data now suggests that interest rate cuts are necessary, but apparently he doesn't want to lower the rates. Still, it probably has to happen now, and Donald Trump is putting massive pressure on him. But we also have other stories, like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund now revealing massive Bitcoin holdings, more purchases, and other exciting things happening around Bitcoin. Before we take a look at all of this, smash the like button below for higher Bitcoin prices and new all-time highs. I've talked about this whole situation several times now, Donald Trump, Jerome Powell, and so on, and why it's so relevant for the stock markets, for Bitcoin, and the like. And now, things are really coming to a head. Now, things are on the verge of escalating, and once again, the renovation debacle, could actually lead to Jerome Powell being removed. And we all know Donald Trump wants to lower interest rates by 3%. That means he wants to make the country one of the leading nations with the lowest interest rates worldwide. Right now, our interest rates are still far from where Donald Trump wants them to be. He wants to get them below the 1% mark. Currently, we're still above 4%, and first, let's take a closer look at exactly what Donald Trump has demanded. Then I'll explain how it came to this, or why Jerome Powell is currently in a tight spot, because we now have new inflation data. And then finally, we'll take a look at why this is so relevant for Bitcoin. So, Donald Trump is making a post here, today, August 12th. As you can see, just a few minutes ago he posted, saying, Jerome, too late. He always says, too late, Powell, Jerome Powell, too late, because he always lowers the interest rates too late, and now he has to cut the rate. Steve Mnuchin really landed me with a bombshell when he suggested this loser. So he's complaining about Jerome Powell, basically saying he now has to work with a loser. The damage he's caused by always being too late is immeasurable. Luckily, the economy is so strong that we've managed to get through Powell and the complacent board. However, I am seriously considering allowing a major lawsuit against Powell because he did a terrible and grossly incompetent job managing the construction of the Fed building here. $3 billion for a project that should have been a $50 million job. Not good. So this is where things get interesting. Donald Trump is now bringing out the big guns here. He's basically getting more and more aggressive, almost increasingly threatening. He's making even harsher threats, because his threats in the past haven't made Jerome Powell lower the interest rates here. There are also insider leaks suggesting that Jerome Powell is apparently siding with the Democrats and wants to get back at the Republicans, including Donald Trump. That's why he's not lowering the interest rates. Actually, it would make sense by now to lower the interest rates, but he just wants to get back at Donald Trump. On the other hand, Donald Trump, let's say, isn't exactly taking the high road here either. What's happening here is almost like bullying. So, he's insulting him here, basically making Jerome Powell out to be some kind of criminal, even though, to be fair, he's not actually doing that bad of a job. That means it's not like Donald Trump always says, that everything is just perfect here. He also posted earlier that billions are now coming in from tariffs, and all of this will pump up the stock market. The economy, prosperity will flourish here, and so on and so forth. But of course, that's just one perspective. On the other hand, the reality is that inflation here is still not completely under control and could potentially escalate at any time. You just can't say for sure right now. He also accused other economists, what was it, from Goldman Sachs, right, that they should go back to being DJs instead of giving financial advice and making financial forecasts and so on. But now we have to take a look, because what just happened is this. We have Donald Trump saying that inflation is not a problem. We have Jerome Powell saying that inflation could become a problem. But now the new inflation data just came out today, so, midday German time, morning in the US. And this inflation data is putting Jerome Powell clearly under a lot of pressure. Let's take a look at what the results are. Here we have CPI inflation, which remained unchanged at 2.7%, below the expected 2.8%, so potentially better than anticipated. And here, core CPI inflation, which has risen a bit to 3.1% and is slightly above expectations. CPI inflation is now, for the first time, above 3.0% here. This now puts the Federal Reserve in a very, very intense spotlight. In other words, a really tough situation. Because now we have a huge discrepancy here. That means, in his last speech, Jerome Powell said, and I'll quote him here, "We refuse to lower interest rates because everyone I know is predicting a significant rise in inflation due to tariffs." But the consumer price index for June once again came in below expectations. Let's listen in directly to what Jerome Powell has to say about this. Attention. Here we go.
What we're waiting for to reduce rates is to understand what will happen with really the tariff inflation. And there's a lot of uncertainty about that. every forecaster you could name who is a professional, forecaster with adequate resources and forecasts for a living is forecasting pretty significant. Everyone that I know is forecasting a meaningful increase in inflation in coming months from tariffs, because someone has to pay for the tariffs, and it will be someone in that chain that I mentioned between the manufacturer, the exporter, the importer, the retailer, ultimately somebody putting it into a good of some kind, or just the consumer buying it. And all through that chain, people will be trying not to be the ones who pick up the cost, but ultimately the cost of the tariff has to be paid, and some of it will fall on the end consumer. We know that because that's what businesses say. That's what the data say from past. So we know that's coming, and we just want to see a little bit of that before we make judgments prematurely.
Also, all the experts, all the analysts are saying that inflation will rise. The whole thing is unexpected, and honestly, Jerome Powell isn't entirely wrong either. But Donald Trump isn't entirely wrong either. That means Donald Trump is in a predicament. Jerome Powell is in a predicament. The Federal Reserve is in a predicament. The entire economy now doesn't know which direction things are going. That means right now we have a lot of uncertainty, and I think both parties are in a very unfortunate situation, and I believe both sides are letting their egos show here, turning this into an ego battle. Jerome Powell, who now wants to maintain his position here, wants to keep his independence. We also have to consider, if Donald Trump really goes through with such a lawsuit and could remove Jerome Powell, then the independence of the central bank is in question. That means, this is what people have often said, okay, central banks are independent and so on, but this independence is obviously also called into question if you can just find some kind of pretext here, because there's this whole story with the lawsuit. I also looked up the details here. Here is the $2.5 billion renovation debacle of the Federal Reserve. Originally approved under Biden's supervision, the project is a summit of bureaucratic bloat, rooftop gardens, VIP elevators, and marble excesses, all while inflation is draining taxpayers dry. And as it said here, this is a classic DC scam, meaning a Washington DC scam. Every dollar wasted here could have gone towards securing the borders or lowering energy costs. It's time to drain the swamp, not fund its palaces here. And yeah, I also think the thing is, now everyone is just trying to pass the buck to someone else. Donald Trump isn't exactly a complete angel either. At first, people thought, okay, Donald Trump really has things under control now. Now more and more situations are coming to light where you realize, okay, maybe he doesn't have things quite as under control as we thought. And states, central banks, central actors, they're always inefficient. That's basically set in stone by definition, because they're not managing their own money, they're managing other people's money. And then you're never really spot on with the planning. That leads to the creation of a whole bureaucracy. Everyone wants a piece of the pie, everyone tries to make some money off it, and then you end up doing things that aren't 100% efficient. And of course, Donald Trump can sue him now, but if you looked into Donald Trump, you'd definitely find things where the US government isn't efficient enough either. They tried it a bit with DUTDGE, but it kind of half failed. And I already have a suspicion about how this whole thing will turn out. They're going to keep putting more and more pressure on Jerome Powell, piling it on, then they'll hit him with lawsuits, and if it's not this lawsuit, they'll just pull another one out of thin air. That's always how it is with politicians. If you want to get rid of someone and you're powerful enough, you'll find some kind of solution, and eventually the pressure will get so high that maybe Jerome Powell himself will say, okay, I'll step down voluntarily. So right now, it's not just Jerome Powell being put under the spotlight, but also Donald Trump, because there are now voices, for example, Peter Schiff, speaking up. And yeah, he doesn't really have anything relevant to say about Bitcoin, but sometimes he does offer interesting economic insights, and I also like to take a critical look at things from time to time. He says here that Trump has already done more lasting damage to our republic and our economy in 7 months than Biden did in 4 years. So it's always difficult to weigh those things against each other. I think Biden was actually even worse in this regard, especially when you look at how anti-crypto he was and all that, but it's always really, really hard to decide. Okay, it's like choosing between the plague and cholera here. He writes here, self-enrichment, budget-busting big beautiful bill, higher federal spending, pressure to abolish the debt ceiling, constant Paul Shelton plans to install a compliant Fed chair. In other words, wanting to put a money printer Fed chair in place who will massively lower interest rates and print endless amounts of money, support for a weak dollar, aggressive market interventions, coercion of private companies, picking winners and losers, unconstitutional self-imposed export bans, and the creation of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Okay, I wouldn't go along with that, and then he makes a few other arguments. So yeah, you can definitely take a critical look at this from both sides. Not just what Paul is doing here, but also what Trump is doing. For Bitcoin, this is definitely a big win. But I mean, I'm not a US citizen, so who am I to judge whether this is good or bad? I'm just reporting different perspectives on the whole thing. Whether it fits or doesn't fit, that's for you to decide for yourselves. But overall, this is definitely good for Bitcoin. The more they argue, the more they get at each other's throats, the more it becomes clear that we need independent money. Money that isn't dependent on the central bank, money that can't just be sued or prosecuted, where there aren't any chairmen of the Fed, where there's no monetary policy that people argue about back and forth. You don't need any of that with Bitcoin, and that's why Bitcoin is clearly the here. And more people are realizing it. For example, here we see the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which has now increased its exposure by 192%. Pretty crazy. They now hold over 7,161 Bitcoin, though probably not directly. It also says indirectly here, which probably means through strategies, through Meta, Coinbase, things like that. So, they basically have indirect Bitcoin exposure, maybe even through an IBIT Bitcoin ETF. I'm not entirely sure, but it's a very interesting story. Then today, we also have the massive purchase by Donald Trump's advisor, who wants to buy $760 million worth of Bitcoin today. Yesterday, I said it would be $1 billion, but apparently, it's not quite $1 billion. That was what was announced, but it seems it's only $760 million. David Bailey talked about over $1 billion yesterday, which is why I mentioned it in the video, but now it's a bit less. Still, that's nothing to sneeze at, $760 million in Bitcoin. The price is already over US dollars here, so it seems like the Fed situation isn't really hurting Bitcoin, but actually helping it, just like these purchases. And feel free to let me know in the comments below how you see it. If you still want to buy Bitcoin, I'll put a link below to 20 Bitcoin, where you can easily and securely buy Bitcoin. And with the code BitcoinHotel, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. Guys, see you next time.